The Rise of Historical Criticism by Oscar Wilde. Historical criticism nowhere occurs as an isolated fact in the civilization or literature of any people. It is part of that complex working towards freedom, which may be described as the revolt against authority. It is merely one facet of that speculative spirit of an innovation, which in the sphere of action produces democracy and revolution, and in that of thought is the parent of philosophy and physical science. And its importance as a factor of progress is based not so much on the results it attains as on the tone of thought which it represents, and by the method by which it works. Being thus the resultant of forces essentially revolutionary, it is not to be found in the ancient world, among the material despotisms of Asia, or the stationary civilization of Egypt. The clay cylinders of Assyria and Babylon, the hieroglyphics of the pyramids, form not history, but the material for history. The Chinese annals, ascending as they do to the barbarous forest life of the nation, are marked with a soberness of judgment, a freedom from invention, which is almost unparalleled in the writings of any people, but the protective spirit which is the characteristic of that people proved as fatal to their literature as to their commerce. Free criticism is as unknown as free trade, while as regards the Hindus, their acute analytical and logical mind is directed rather to grammar criticism and philosophy than to history or chronology. Indeed, in their history, their imagination seems to have run wild. Legend and fact are so indissolubly mingled together that any attempt to separate them seems vain. If we accept the identification of the Greek Sandrocrates with the Indian Chandragupta, we have really no clue by which we can test the truth of their writings or examine their method of investigation. It is among the Hellenic branch of the Indo-Germanic race that history proper is to be found, as well as the spirit of historical criticism among the wonderful offshoot of the primitive Aryans whom we call by the name of Greeks, and to whom it has been well said, we owe all that moves in the world except the blind forces of nature. For from the day when they left the chill tablelands of Tibet and journeyed, a nomad people, to Asian shores, the characteristic of their nature has been the search for light, and the spirit of historical criticism is part of that wonderful Aufklärung, or illumination of the intellect, which seems to have burst on the Greek race like a great flood of light about the 6th century BC. L'esprit d'un siècle ne naît pas et ne meurt pas à jour fixe. The spirit of an age is not born and does not die on a definite day. And the first critic is perhaps as difficult to discover as the first man. It is from democracy that the spirit of criticism borrows its intolerance of dogmatic authority, from physical science to the alluring analogies of law and order, and from philosophy, the conception of an essential unity underlying the complex manifestations of phenomena. It appears first as rather a changed attitude of mind than as a principle of research, and its earliest influences are to be found in the sacred writings. For men begin to doubt in questions of religion first, and then in matters of more secular interest. And as regards the nature of the spirit of historical criticism itself and its ultimate development, it is not merely confined to the empirical method of ascertaining whether an event happened or not, but is concerned also with the investigation into the causes of events, the general relations which phenomena of life hold to one another, and in its ultimate development passes into the wider question of the philosophy of history. Now, while the workings of historical criticism in these two spheres of sacred and uninspired history are essentially manifestations of the same spirit, yet their methods are so different, the canons of evidence so entirely separate, and the motives in each case so unconnected, that it will be necessary for a clear estimation of the progress of Greek thought that we should consider these two questions entirely apart from one another. I shall then in both cases take the succession of writers in their chronological order as representing the rational order, not that the succession of time is always the succession of ideas, or that dialectics moves ever in the straight line in which Hegel conceives its advance. In Greek thought, as elsewhere, there are periods of stagnation and apparent retrogression, yet their intellectual development, not merely in the question of historical criticism, but in their art, their poetry, and their philosophy, seems so essentially normal, so free from all disturbing external influences, so peculiarly rational, that in following in the footsteps of time, we shall really be progressing in the order sanctioned by reason. At an early period in their intellectual development, the Greeks reached that critical point in the history of every civilized nation, when speculative invades the domain of revealed truth, when the spiritual ideas of the people can no longer be satisfied by the lower material conceptions of their inspired writers, and when men find it impossible to pour the new wine of free thought into the old bottles of a narrow and trammeling creed. From their Aryan ancestors, they had received the fatal legacy of a mythology with immoral and monstrous stories which strove to hide the rational order of nature in a chaos of miracles, and to mar by imputed wickedness the perfection of God's nature, a very shirt of Nessos, in which the Heracles of rationalism barely escaped annihilation. Now, while undoubtedly the speculation of Thales and the alluring analogies of law and order afforded by physical science were most important forces in encouraging the rise of the spirit of skepticism, yet it was on its ethical side that the Greek mythology was chiefly open to attack. It is difficult to shake the popular belief in miracles, but no man will admit sin and immortality as attributes of the ideal he worships. So the first symptoms of a new order of thought are shown in the passionate outcries of Xenophanes and Heraclitus against the evil things said by Homer of the sons of God, and in the story told by Pythagoras, how that he saw tortured in hell the two founders of Greek theology. We can recognize the rise in the Aufklärung as clearly as we see the Reformation foreshadowed in the Inferno of Dante. Any honest belief then in the plain truth of these stories soon succumbed before the destructive effects of the a priori ethical criticism of this school. But the orthodox party, as is their custom, found immediately a convenient shelter under the aegis of the doctrine of metaphors and concealed meanings. To this allegorical school, the tale of the fight around walls of Troy was a mystery, behind which, as behind a veil, were hidden certain moral and physical truths. The contest between Athena and Ares was that eternal contest between rational thought and the brute force of ignorance. The arrows which rattled in the quiver of the far darter, Lord of Men, were no longer the instruments of vengeance shot from the golden bow of the child of God, but the common rays of the sun, which was itself nothing but a mere inert mass of burning metal. Modern investigation with the ruthlessness of Philistine analysis has ultimately brought Helen of Troy down to a symbol of the dawn. There were Philistines among the Greeks who also saw in the that's the Lord of the Men, who saw in the Lord of Men a mere metaphor for atmospheric power. Now, while this tendency to look for metaphors and hidden meaning must be ranked as one of the germs of historical criticism, yet it was essentially unscientific. Its inherent weakness is clearly pointed out by Plato, who shows that while this theory will no doubt explain many of the current legends, yet if it is to be appealed to at all, it must be as a universal principle, a position he is by no means prepared to admit. Like many other great principles, it suffered from its disciples, and furnished its own refutation when the web of Penelope was analyzed into a metaphor of the rules of formal logic, the warp representing the premises, and the woof the conclusion. Rejecting then the allegorical interpretation of the sacred writings as an essentially dangerous method, proving either too much or too little, Plato himself returns to the earlier mode of attack and rewrites history with a didactic purpose, laying down certain ethical canons of historical criticism. God is good, God is just, God is true, God is without the common passions of men. There are the tests to which we are to bring the stories of the Greek religion. God predestines no men to ruin, nor sends destruction on innocent cities. He never walks the earth in strange disguise, nor has to mourn for the death of any well-beloved son. Away with the tears for Sarpedon, the lying dream sent to Agamemnon, and the story of the broken covenant in Plato's Republic. Similar ethical canons are applied to the accounts of the heroes of the days of old, and by the same a priori principles Achilles is rescued from the charges of avarice and insolence, in a passage which may be recited as the earliest instant of that whitewashing of great men, as it has been called, which is so popular in our own day. When Catilinus and Clodius are represented as honest and far-seeing politicians, when eine edle und gute Natur, a noble and fine nature, is claimed for Tiberius, and Nero was rescued from his heritage of infamy as an accomplished dilettante, whose moral aberrations are more than excused by his exquisite artistic sense and charming tenor voice. But besides the allegorizing principle of interpretation and the ethical reconstruction of history, there was a third theory, which may be called the semi-historical, and which goes by the name of Euhemeros, even though he was by no means the first to propound it. Appealing to a fictitious monument, which he declared that he had discovered on the island of Panchaea, and which purported to be a column covered on the island, which purported to be a column erected by Zeus, and detailing the incidents of his reign on earth, this shallow thinker attempted to show that the gods and heroes of ancient Greece were mere ordinary mortals, whose achievements had been a good deal exaggerated and misrepresented, and that the proper canon of historical criticism as regards the treatment of myths was to rationalize the incredible and to present the plausible residuum as actual truth. To him and his school, the centaurs, for instance, those mythical sons of the storm, strange links between the lives of men and animals, were merely some youths from the village of Nephili in Thessaly, distinguished for their sporting tastes, the living harvest of panoplied knights, which sprang so mystically from the dragon's teeth, a body of mercenary troops, supported by the profits on a successful speculation in ivory, and Actaeon, an ordinary master of hounds, who, living before the days of subscription, was eaten out of house and home by the expenses of his kennel. Now that under the glamour of myth and legend some substratum of historical fact may lie, is a proposition rendered extremely probable by the modern investigations into the working of the mythopoeic spirit in post-Christian times. Charlemagne and Roland, St. Francis and William Tell, are none the less real personages because their histories are filled with much that is fictitious and incredible. But in all cases, what is essentially necessary is some external corroboration, such as is afforded by the mention of Roland and Roncesvalles.